Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. So, leaked audio from a meeting of China's war generals reveals detailed plans for a potential land invasion of the United States sometime by the end of the year. So, what indicators do we see that the CCP is preparing for war? Are war machines in a wartime economy already being prepped for a last-ditch effort before they crumble? This is going to be a very important interview with communism expert Jeff Nyquist that you will not want to miss. So, folks, if you're not following me on social media, make sure you're following me on Telegram and Truth Social as Man in America. And today's show is brought to you by Rise TV. Rise TV is literally the reason I can do Man in America full time. With the big tech censorship and demonetization, they've made it really tough for people like me with a mission to tell the truth. And that's why we built Rise TV. Folks, right now we are at war, and you will see it even more so in today's show. And it's an information war. And Man in America is how I'm fighting. So we have on Rise TV a massive content library and an amazing community of patriots. And for the second half of today's show, we'll do a Q&A over on Rise TV where you can ask Jeff your questions. So if you want to check it out, there's a link for a free trial in the description below. So come try it out. I think you're going to end up staying. And folks, look, I believe we have some very shaky times ahead of us. The dollar is nearing collapse, which is actually one of the main objectives of the CCP, as you'll see in today's show. And a lot of folks are looking for ways to protect their wealth. And I've always been one to recommend physical gold and silver. For this, I'm confident in recommending Noble Gold. You can buy gold and silver directly, or you can do an IRA transfer. So Noble Gold specializes in IRA transfers, which allow you to transfer your IRA assets into physical gold and silver that you own with zero taxes or penalties. So if you want to learn more about this, open up a new tab right now and go to goldwithseth.com, or you can call 877-646-5347 to speak to someone right now here in America. Again, it's 877-646-5347. All right, folks, so we're going to jump right into today's interview. There is some incredible information coming out about potential plans that the Chinese Communist Party has for Taiwan, and it looks like there's a good chance of plans towards an attack on the United States. And on my show today, I'll be joined by an absolute expert and author on everything as it relates to communism, especially Russia and the CCP. So, folks, let's go ahead and welcome Jeff Nyquist. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Seth.
And I think this is our fourth interview, our fourth discussion about what before had referred to as China's endgame, which they're now referring to as the final war as things are heating up. So this leaked audio had come out recently. It was Jennifer Zhang who had broke this information. And I know that you've studied it in depth to validate it. So can you just tell us, what is this? What is it what information has come out of the CCP, and what's it telling us about what they're potentially planning?
Well, actually, Jennifer was the first person to beat everybody to translating the recording from the Chinese dialect that was spoken at this Guangdong Standing Party Committee meeting that happened apparently on May 14th. It was actually the Luda group, that their network of contacts in China, that got it out. And I had a chance to speak to people involved in that. Dr. Li Meng Yan was the person I spoke to. They have more information than is on the tape. And I should sort of frame this by something everyone can look up. It's the May 19th Wall Street Journal article. The headline is, China insists party elites shed overseas assets, eyeing Western assets. That is about how China is preparing to seize Western assets in China, and they want to pull their assets back from overseas so they don't get seized. This is a pre-war move. It's a very unambiguous pre-war move, just like they're stockpiling of food and fuel and war materials, just like their the other preparations. For example, this recorded meeting where they talk about a mobilization order that was given by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China to mobilize for war. They call it the transition from normal to war. So what we are talking about is China is going to war. It's not if or whatever, they're going to war. And from analyzing the transcript, it's going to start anytime from, now this meeting was May 14th, from 90 days from the 14th to before, I'm told, before November 1st. That's the window that I'm told. I mean, this can change, I assume. Countries getting ready for war, they have things that go wrong. But this is what we get from the intelligence we're receiving.
So, in this transcript, which I've read the majority of, it's quite a long transcript. That was the one thing that I saw consistently mentioned in there was just a transition into a wartime economy, wartime production. And also even internally, both internally and then externally, kind of around the world, propaganda surrounding this wartime effort to make sure that all the Chinese people are on board with it and they're pridefully fighting for the motherland. So what is it? Am I correct in understanding that what you're seeing here is the very concrete actions of China really gearing up to like take actually very real actions of a war, a kinetic war in the world today?
2 years ago, last March, we started seeing Chinese military publications saying that war is coming. We saw it in the Eastern Theater. Their official publications said this is not going to be a drill. We are going to war. You had Chinese nationals on Twitter, on other social media saying, yeah, we're being told that China is going to war. I had a Hong Kong businessman. I'm on the committee for the present danger of China. He's told the committee he had extensive contacts in Beijing, that his contacts were telling him, and this was a year ago this month, that China was preparing for a war within months, that they were actively getting ready. And now, from all kinds of sources, I had sources from Southeast Asia, from the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that those countries were being told that both China and Russia were getting ready for war against the United States. And they were beginning the actions, the process. Now we're seeing you can't organize for a war on this scale without it basically becoming widely known. Because we're talking about, look, they're talking about mobilizing in just one province of China, almost 1,000 ships, right? They're talking about retrofitting 64 10,000-ton ro-ro ships that can carry more vehicles than were used by Hitler to invade Russia. Okay, we're just talking about the logistical preps that they were discussing there. So 45 days to retrofit the ro-ro ships, and the guy was saying, the responsible was saying, I can't do it in 45 days. I can almost do it, right? And then you had in addition, you had 588 rail cars. And if you did a calculation, it would take you about maybe 45, 50 days to move all the vehicles that you could put on those ro-ro ships by train to the ports in Guangdong. That's just Guangdong. That's not even the theater that's normally assigned to invade Taiwan. The Eastern Theater Command is to invade Taiwan. What the heck are they doing? And then there's the coordination with Russia, which we can talk about.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I really want to get your thoughts on that, because the transcript is talking very specifically about Taiwan, but do you believe that they anticipate that if they attack Taiwan, that Biden is going to retaliate in some form, and that they will then have to mobilize a fleet to come over to America? And how do you think that would play out?
Well, there's towards the end, the latter part of the transcript is really interesting because it's about defending the targets in Guangdong, right? And then how they're going to deploy. This was the one argument the officials had. They had an argument that was so nasty that they asked the governor to mediate, and he absolutely refused. He put it on the military district commander. He said, you decide, commander. I don't want any part of this. They were arguing about how to deploy the People's Armed Police. Or were they going to put the police to defend against riots and social unrest that would be triggered, the suggestion was, by military strikes on the province, right? Creating social disorder. Or were they going to defend against those military strikes implying that there would be maybe sabotage agents coming in, maybe from the coast. Lurking spies was the translation in Jennifer Zhang's translation. Coming into the coast. So, and this argument broke out, no, we have to defend the 4 nuclear power plants and the command center. We have to have the People's Army. And then others saying, no, we have to defend against an uprising in the megacities. And that was an interesting element. And the commissar, the political commissar, Wang Shuzhen, chimed in, and he said, well, we can help by using propaganda and psychological warfare. We need to explain to the Chinese people that it's America's fault because America is counterattacking us on these targets and causing the problems. And this was the most alarming, maybe the most alarming sentence in the whole meeting, because he used the word counterattack. That's in more than one translation. And one lady who listened to it, who has defense background, said this implies that they're going to use DF-41s, their ICBMs, on the US, and that they're expecting a counterstrike. This is the way some analysts read it.
And so how would they, if they're going to, is DF-41, is that what it's called? The type of missile?
Yeah, it's Dongfeng 41. It's the most recent, most modern Chinese ICBM. It was deployed starting in 2019.
So how would they get those close enough to the United States? I know that there's been discussion.
No, they're ICBMs.
I
they
see.
can
So
hit
they're
anywhere
even
in the United
there.
States from China. Yeah,
I see.
They can hit anywhere. They have multiple warheads can be put in each of them, so each one can hit more than one target. We don't really, I don't think we know the exact number of those that they've had. They were rapidly building missile silos. This was detected many months ago. How many missiles are in those silos now? This is very alarming, right? Because it sounds like they're anticipating a nuclear war.
And do you think so? Something that I'd also seen in this discussion is that part of the reason for the Shanghai lockdowns was so they could pause a lot of the international shipping. And you see this being discussed a lot in the transcript, the conversion of regular cargo ships basically into war machines. And I know that I'll pull up a graphic here really quickly, but there in the previously was a lot of information that had come out about their container ship missiles, and basically how China could retrofit a container ship, park it off the coast of America, and all of a sudden they open up these missiles. Now here's a different image. This is from China, right? Where then one day they open up and they start firing on the mainland. Yeah. You see that?
The Russians developed this technology. It's been dubbed Club K. The idea is you can put cruise missile systems in these containers, and they're hidden inside, and they can open up, and suddenly a merchant ship can become a missile platform for launching cruise missiles. The cruise missiles, of course, could have nuclear warheads or conventional, and modern cruise missiles are pretty accurate, and they could do a Pearl Harbor style attack on San Diego Bay, on Bremerton, on Pearl Harbor, on various military facilities that support our fleet.
And so you mentioned the most alarming part of this transcript for you was the counterattacking from America. And that was also one thing I pulled away from that, was more so it just seemed like they're preparing for something much greater than just an interaction with Taiwan. Yeah. Like it was almost like they're preparing for World War III.
Yes, you're exactly right. It is. Well, look, we're talking about one province, and you've got more ships being mobilized and more assets than we did for the invasion of Normandy, which was the biggest invasion. Now, obviously, I have to make this statement. Look, Taiwan has 170,000 standing army. They have 1.5 million reserves on an island. This is a much bigger. Taiwan has actually military capacity actually as great as Ukraine, only in an island that is mostly mountain and rough terrain, where the flat areas around the coast, particularly on the west side of the island, are very urbanized. So the flat areas where you would use armor, tanks, are very urban. Of course, tanks aren't really suitable to use against cities. It's infantry that you want to use, infantry and artillery, as we see in the Ukraine war. And so, knowing operational art of war, when the number of vehicles just in Guangdong province they're preparing to load by retrofitting the Ro-Ro ships is more than they could practically use on Taiwan, right? Because of the terrain, because of the urbanization of Taiwan, you would be using mostly infantry and artillery in that battle. And that's not what we're seeing. This is enough for, I don't know, 18, 20 motorized, mechanized, Chinese call mechanized divisions to move the vehicles. Well, where the heck are they going to? I mean, first of all, if you're invading Taiwan, that's a short distance away from. You don't need 64, and you don't need that many. You could use, 20 Ro-Ro ships with repeat trips, right? Because they can go back and forth. And besides the port, you got to get a port to offload a Ro-Ro ship. You can't offload it on a beach. Even if you have mulberries, we did that at Normandy to offload. The offload capacity isn't going to be for 64 ships. It's impossible. So it's way too many vehicles for Taiwan. I mean, it's way too many ships for Taiwan. This is very obvious. And then there's another consideration that everybody should consider. This is would be on the level of invading, Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan. And the invasion of Japan, horrific. We would expect, some people said we lose 1 million men. This would be way above Normandy. This was the biggest amphibious invasion ever contemplated by the U.S. This kind of invasion by China would be on that scale, but the type of ships they're preparing aren't the type of ships you would use in that kind of invasion. Very, very intriguing and alarming, just from analyzing, and that's just one province in one military theater command, which isn't even the one they would invade Taiwan from.
So I know that you've talked a lot in the past about the coordination between Russia and China, and the timing of what's happening in Ukraine is you couldn't plan a better time, because as I understand it, a lot of our resources, the United States resources, are assigned and over in Ukraine, leaving us very vulnerable. And even the ability that we would have to, say, manufacture more of what we would need to combat this. I was listening to an interview recently with you and Mike Adams where you said we're a couple years out of the ability to produce what we would need. So do you think that what's happening with Ukraine was part of a plan between China and Russia to lure the U.S.'s resources to that region, leaving our country more vulnerable?
It does appear to be that the Russians have drawn our attention to Eastern Europe to help the Chinese in what they're preparing for. That is an obvious conclusion that any strategist would be likely to make. What I would say is that, when you look at America moving 110,000 troops to Eastern Europe, sending, more javelins, it would take us 2 years to double our production of these anti-tank weapons. And we've used up 4-year supply by sending them to Ukraine. This is alarming, especially when you look at the number of vehicles the Chinese are preparing to put on the water. Tanks, APCs, self-propelled artillery, and that's just from one province, as I said. There's several coastal provinces that have, by the way, more military resources than that one does. So, yeah, it does look that way. And I would add, I asked the people who smuggled this recording, 56-minute recording of the generals and officials meeting. I asked them what are they hearing through their sources in the Chinese military about Russia and about the Ukraine operation. And the one thing they told me was that, well, the generals and the People's Liberation Army are saying that the Russians have not used their best troops in Ukraine, that Russia's best troops are hiding in the Far East. They're hiding in Siberia. And I said, Okay. And of course, you got to remember that on February 4th, Putin went to Beijing at the beginning of the Olympics and met, and they made a joint statement saying that China and Russia is the most powerful combination of great powers, more powerful than anything during the Cold War. They made this kind of a statement. So uh, it does indeed look like, they've got, the Russians are going to participate in whatever this is in the Pacific. And what's alarming is if you look back to an exercise called Vostok 18, took place in 2018. It was a practice, Russian practice involving Chinese and Mongolian forces to invade Alaska. They massed ships at the Bering Strait. So, what are they going to do now? What are they preparing?
The more evidence stacks up, you can see that it really points towards one thing. You've spoken before about the fifth column. Can you explain that? Because that's also something I'm seeing surrounding a lot of this discussion is large weapons caches, and even in this leaked audio talking about activating foreign assets of people to kind of fight and put forth this war. So can you explain what the fifth column is and how that relates to the United States?
Yeah, the fifth column is forces that would be sympathetic to an invader that are in the country that's being invaded that would help them. For example, the pro-Nazi activists in Norway, before the Nazis invaded Norway in 1940, you had the defense minister of Norway was a Nazi sympathizer. Quisling, we get the word Quisling, that's his name, Defense Minister Quisling. He helped the Germans get a foothold in Norway. He was actively supporting them. He ended up becoming the ruler of Nazi-occupied Norway afterwards. So it's a combination of traitors and sympathizers and infiltrators of the country in advance. And we have lots of Chinese all over Canada, United States, Mexico, South America. They control port assets. They've been managing ports in the United States. They control container areas of the port, storage areas. This has been a very dangerous thing for us to do. And look, when the people talk about, Normandy, it's a beach invasion with small craft supported by 150 ships that basically then brought across the English Channel the rest of the invasion force. When we look at this, it's not, the Norway wasn't a beach invasion. The invasion was done when Norway was at peace with Germany. They were trading partners. The German trading ships, the merchant ships, came into the ports, but instead of having merchandise, they had troops and equipment that came out, seized the port, opened the port up for other ships to come in. And by the way, it wasn't a giant fleet that showed up. It was one ship they were trickling in. And the reason why, they had to get by the British fleet, which was right off the coast of Norway laying mines. So the Germans conducted an invasion, and the British fleet ruled the seas. It was the biggest navy in the world at the time. So the British fleet is along the Norwegian coast laying mines, and here this German invasion of these merchant ships spaced apart, infiltrated by them. They did sink a few of them, infiltrated right by, got in the ports and took all the ports up and down the whole. Norway is just a giant coastline. It's a huge coastline. From Narvik to Bergen. Of course, they had to force their way up Oslo Fjord. They lost, I think, a pocket battleship fighting their way up. There was gun defenses. But other than that, it was just an infiltration. And this is alarming for our friends in Latin America because the Chinese control so many ports. They're building a giant port in Peru. It's alarming for our friends in Australia. Any country that trades with China is going to have this threat, because if the ships are all sent out, you got your stopwatch, all the ships will arrive at a certain time, they'll offload, they'll seize the ports. How much of the Pacific Rim could be captured by this a giant movement, right? China, I've heard military people say this ridiculous thing that China doesn't have the sea lift capacity. Are you kidding? The Chinese Transport Ministry says they have 142 million tons of shipping capacity in China. in 240 Chinese-owned companies, shipping companies. So, okay, so to give that, people don't know what that means, 142 million tons. Japan, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, had 7.7 million tons. And with that, they occupied French Indochina, they invaded the Philippines, Borneo, Indonesia, a vast archipelago, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Wake, Guam, the Aleutian, the two outermost Aleutian Islands, and if they won the Battle of Midway, they would have occupied Hawaii. That's on 7.7 million tons. All right, we're talking about almost 20 times the lift capacity, right?
So we know that China has been very long-term in their approach with this, and part of this process has been infiltration of governments to weaken those governments. Do you think that Biden is aware of what China is doing? Do you think that Biden is actually acting on behalf of China? Because if you look at a lot of the actions that he's been carrying out, it's almost as if he's trying to weaken America and make us ripe for the picking for China.
Yeah, I don't even think that if somebody had been in China's pocket, paid for, if they knew what was being prepared, they would continue to cooperate with it. Because nobody wants to be hanged or lynched by their own countrymen, which is what would happen if this played out. I would give him zero chance of physical survival. His own Secret Service men would probably shoot him out of hand if it becomes clear that he had cooperated in this. I don't think that. I think he's playing the role of a useful idiot. We know that from the Hunter Biden laptop, if that's to be taken seriously, it appears they've taken a lot of money, the Biden family, from the Chinese sources. I think the Chinese have been very expert at involving us in business that's very lucrative, so that large corporations and politicians who receive money from those companies, China is going to withdraw their company if we're too anti-Chinese. Hollywood tried to make Red Dawn as a Chinese invasion. And Hollywood couldn't do it because China said, you can't make a movie where you depict China as invading America. That was very sensitive to China. They didn't want Red Dawn made with Chinese invaders. Why? And Hollywood self-censored itself. They made it ridiculous about an invasion from North Korea. North Korea can't invade the U.S. It's impossible. It's absurd, right? But Hollywood changed the movie for China. This shows if China has the influence. Imagine if, the original Red Dawn was in the 80s, was the Soviet Union invading the lower 48, which was the Soviet Union's plan at the time, by the way.
It made sense. The movie made sense for that time
they would invade,
history.
right? But the Russians didn't have the influence in Hollywood to cancel the film. But China had the influence. So you see how dangerous Chinese influence is and how it paves the way for this preparation that, now they're not going to invade. Don't listen to that conspiracy theorist. And they're retrofitting the ships, right? For what? Where are they going with that much armor? Is it really Taiwan? I'm skeptical. And let me read you the defense minister of China's statement about invading Taiwan. This was made 20 years ago. It was the defense minister of China, Chiao Chen, at the end of a speech about attacking America, using biological weapons on America, which some people feel the COVID was a Chinese biological attack. Here's what Chiao Chen says in the speech. So this is how he ends the speech.
So this was the Minister of Defense from China? This is around, 20 years ago?
Chiao Chen, 20 years ago. This is what he said. This is a quote. This puts everything in context for me. He says, as long as we resolve the United States problem at one blow, our domestic problems will all be readily solved. Therefore, our military battle preparation appears to aim at Taiwan, but in fact is aimed at the United States.
Wow.
And the preparation is far beyond the scope of attacking aircraft carriers and satellites, right? This is out of the horse's mouth here. Now, I'll give you two other data points that support this quote. I was contacted by a British journalist who was very upset. This is 17 years ago, 18 years ago. She said, I need to talk to someone about you, I need to talk to somebody about an experience I had, and I've almost wrecked my career talking about it within the BBC and other British media. So I have to relieve my conscience. I have to tell somebody, and I'm told you're somebody that might be able to use the information that you would actually credit it, because I'm told to shut up, that say nothing. She was part of a film crew doing a documentary in the South China Sea, and they were allowed to be filming a amphibious exercise by the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy. And they actually, I guess you could say, made the mistake of actually interviewing sailors. And they started asking the sailors this question: how do you feel about invading Taiwan? You're practicing for invading Taiwan. How do you feel about it? And the sailors would say, we're not practicing to invade Taiwan. We're practicing to invade the United States. And pretty soon it got back to the Chinese officials that this is what they were recording. Chinese officials kicked them out of the fleet, took away their cameras, and she ended up going back to England. And she started saying, repeating this story to other journalists and to her bosses, and they ended up telling her, shut up. Do not repeat that story. This is because of the involvement of British commercial companies in China, that it would damage their commercial relationships. That's another data point. Now I'll tell you a third data point. Years ago, I worked with Colonel Stanislav Lunev on different projects. He was the highest ranking defector from the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff. He spoke fluent Mandarin. He worked in China. And he told me about, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this military conference that he attended. He was one of those people that read plans, knew how to read and be involved in military planning. And it was about a future invasion of North America. And they said, look, Russia's military is shrinking because of the transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation, but we're not terminating our plans for war with the United States. We're going to go ahead with those only with China as our partner. We have made certain agreements with China. We are going to invade Alaska and parts of Canada. China is going to invade the lower 48. We provide the missile firepower. They provide the overwhelming bulk of the manpower, the invading force. And that this is, obviously a long-term, preparation, because you can't just pop up and do this without really long-term coordinated planning between Russia and China. And I asked him seriously, I said, do you think China and Russia could defeat the United States? And he says, yes. And I said, right now? Well, they could do it right now, but it's better to wait. They have better chances the longer they prepare. And that was his analysis. And I had many conversations with him about it and how it would work. And it's very frightening when you put these data points together with this recording of this military-civil meeting of the Communist Party Standing Committee in Guangdong, because it actually fits together. All the information fits with what I know.
And the most interesting part that you just talked about is just how they are using Taiwan as a mask. It's all about Taiwan when in fact they're talking about America. But one thing I want to really understand your thoughts on is Shanghai, because that's something I've had a really hard time making sense of why they're locking down nearly 30 million people in Shanghai. How does that fit into the bigger picture?
I think that the total number of people being locked down is over 280 million now. And the number of ports locked down is more than just Shanghai. Why? Because in the transition from normal to war, you're not going to be making stuff for Walmart anymore. If you're going to war with the US, you're not going to be shipping consumer goods. You're not going to be making anything for our supply chain whatsoever. So you have to transition your factories. Chinese factories are made with the idea of dual civilian military use. They can be converted to war production. So I understand that when these lockdowns started, they were already converting the factories over to war production. So you are making junk for Walmart. Now you're making ammunition or spare parts for tanks or vehicles or trucks or uniforms, whatever. Instead of making clothing, you're making military uniforms. So it seems to me that that's one aspect. Then if you have to get the ports ready for thousands of ships to be prepared to load troops, you can't have those ships loading consumer goods, right? And you don't want your population to know everything, because then all the details leak out through social media. They end up, you need to cut the internet off. You need to maybe target American satellites before you do this. You need to, it's impossible to make this preparation without it being observed. So it's very important that when we see the preparations, we think it's all for Taiwan. Oh, wow, this is an Olympic style operation. Taiwan has, 1.5 million troops. The Chinese have to mass an enormous invasion. So that's what all this is. But look, the United States in World War II thought, we're not going to invade Taiwan. And the Japanese forces on Taiwan weren't even as powerful as the ones that we're seeing now that the Chinese have. The Taiwanese have. So we said, it's too ridiculous. We're not going to sacrifice men invading this because we can just blockade it and bypass it. It'll have to surrender, which it did. Surrendered without a fight. Most of the Japanese island strongholds surrendered because we had them surrounded. And they surrendered at the end of the war or after the end of the war. Why would they do that? So, talking in terms of practical military operations, we're looking at something much larger involving all 5 of the Chinese theater commands, not just one province.
What about all of the guns in America? I'm sure that they fear. Really, America is the world's largest standing army. If you look at the civilian-held guns and ammunition. So how does that, do you think they see that as a significant threat? Could that be also some of the pushes for gun control? Do you think maybe there's some strings being pulled there for these politicians in the United States to disarm Americans? Like if you look at California, for instance, which is, would be one of their, say, kind of beachheads to invade, through the coast of California, where Newsom, and I've heard a lot of rumors of suspicious ties and bribes from China, where it makes it very difficult to get the kind of guns that you would actually need to defend yourself against a military invasion.
Yeah, obviously, civilian small arms would be very important for defending really terrain with a lot of forest, like they have in Northern California, cities, urban areas. But you do need anti-tank weapons, which we've sent so many to Ukraine. Look, how does a guy with a rifle stop an APC or a tank? He can't. You can have millions of guys. What did General Yamamoto say? Every blade of grass will have a rifle behind it. That's a misunderstanding of how war works. Let me give you a statistic that is kind of helpful. World War II. In the first half of World War II, the number one thing that killed soldiers on the Allied side was the German Mauser rifle. The rifle was the number one killer in the first half of the war. It killed the most. Second half of the war, no. Second half of the war, the number one killer was the American aircraft. They killed more German soldiers than any rifles, right? So in terms of the kind of war you're waging, you can have a war where artillery is killing more people or armor is killing more people, because modern war is combined arms. If you have just infantry, you're vulnerable to artillery and tanks. If you have just tanks, you're vulnerable to infantry. If those tanks advance into places where infantry is hiding in buildings or covering terrain. So it is a complicated thing, but you got to remember that China could raise, 30 million troops. And with the size of its lift capacity, it could send 5-10 million troops here. And then you have weapons of mass destruction. You have biological weapons, you have nuclear weapons. They can nuke the major cities and bypass them, right? Look, the streetcars were operating the next morning in Hiroshima. You could nuke the major cities. It wouldn't kill everybody unless they use multiple nukes on singular cities. They might do that in some cases. But they could use these kind of terror tactics to force areas of the country just to give up. And then you have the problem with, how are your riflemen with a rifle behind every blade of grass, how are they eating? Where are they getting their food? If transportation, communications, food, if they use an EMP and it knocks out the electricity, how are they able to pump water out of the ground to drink? How many people are going to die of dehydration? How many are going to die of starvation? These are questions we don't know the answer to. And look, if 3 million German troops invaded Russia and occupied huge areas of the Soviet Union, major cities, the third largest city in Russia, the two largest cities in Ukraine, uh, how is it, that China couldn't do it? They don't care about casualties. They're 1.4 billion people, right? So how does it, countries are taken over by armies all the time. And the Chinese, above all, are able to sustain the casualties. 1.4 billion people. If they lost 10 million people, that would be nothing to them.
Well, they're voluntarily killing 10 million of their own citizens just for religious belief or organs or anything. They will sacrifice people very quickly.
That's a very good point. I was just rereading the history of Mao's Civil War thing. He actually killed more of his own people, mobilizing his army in the Civil War than the enemy killed. So you have to understand, they are right now, one of the things Dr. Li Mengyan told me was that they are now combing through part of these lockdowns. They're combing through the population, and they are eliminating who they consider to be unreliable, which is what Mao did in the 2 years leading up to the finale of the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s. He cleansed his army of 150,000 people that he thought were unreliable. They either were executed, or they knew they were going to be executed and they fled. They just deserted and fled. So that's just, and that's in the scale we're talking about, that's nothing. I mean, look, 1.4 billion people. If they murder 100 million of their own people, Mao is I think the Guinness Book of World Records credits him with 60 million, and some people say it's a lot higher than that Mao killed. And these are the followers of Mao. They believe the same things Mao did. In fact, Xi Jinping is a big guy on Mao Zedong thought, and he has three people that he admires, according to Stephen Mosher, who wrote a book on this. He's a China expert. He said, Xi Jinping admires Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler. He's even had a statue of Hitler made that he keeps in his, I think Mosher said, in his residence. So these are his models, right?
Those are the three bad biggest models.
The three biggest mass murderers. Go to the Guinness Book of World Records. The three biggest mass murderers in history: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And Mao makes Stalin and Hitler look like pikers by comparison. He was the real big killer.
And that's just a quick side point there, is that it's interesting how in Hollywood, every movie about mass killing is always about Hitler. It's never about, how many blockbuster movies have been about China and about Mao Zedong?
Right.
Never.
Right. And by the way, Mao Zedong's great buddy, Pol Pot, who used to play pool with Mao in China, Mao liked to play pool. He killed between a quarter and a third of the population of Cambodia when he took over. That was the Cambodian genocide. The killing fields, as they call it. So the communists, if people think the communists are bloodthirsty, murderous, power-lusting, they're psychopaths, they're criminals of the most unbelievable kind. If you read the more recent, Chinese and a Western scholar got together and did a biography of Mao, you literally want to vomit. He is so violent, he is so foul. He would come he took control of an army, and all of a sudden, all the commanders in the army started dying. Now, there's other red armies at the time, and nobody was dying in any of them. And it's all the commanders are dying, and you figure out he's killing them all because he wants to put his own puppets in that army. He wants to be sure he controls it. Control was Mao's obsession. It is Deng Xiaoping's exception. I'm sorry, it is his obsession too, to control. And that, when we look at the lockdowns and the port closures as the sources of this, as Dr. Li Mengyang is explained to me, it's about control. All of this is about control. And if they can control the population, They can make the transition from normal to war. They can feed the war economy. They can organize the forces. They can win the war.
So just for just a quick note for anybody that is just joining. So there's a lot of people that are joining and watching live. I'm interviewing Jeff Nyquist. This is a critical discussion on China basically preparing for war. So we always do a Q&A at the end of the show. It's over on Rise TV only. Because this information is so important, we're going to keep the Q&A portion still public. However, if you want to ask a question, I'm only going to be fielding questions from over at Rise TV. So if you have a specific question for Jeff you want to ask, and you want to be part of that discussion, head on over. There's a link in the description below for a free trial to Rise TV. But we'll be taking questions from Rise TV. But as I mentioned, for those of you that are watching on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble especially, we'll keep this public for you to watch this because this is a very important discussion. Now, Jeff, you spoke recently about how some of your contacts on Wall Street were telling you they expected a collapse of China's economy within the next year. So can you touch on that a little bit, but also talk about, is that also what's propelling them? Like they have to transition to a war economy because they're on the verge of a collapse. They have to change something to survive. Is this a last ditch effort for them?
Well, that's a good question. I put it in the context. I think they've been preparing for this for a long time. But last October, a Wall Street banker who's an expert in economic warfare made the statement before a group meeting that I attended that China's economy was going to collapse by the end of the second quarter in 2022. And he thought that they would have to go to war in March or April. And of course, he was rather more elated, more happy at the beginning of March. I think it was late February, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He saw that China was not going to go to war in March or April. So he thought they were just going to hit the wall when it comes to the end of June. So he thought they were done. They were going to unravel. But what we see in this war preparation is it's not, if they can successfully transition from a normal economy, this is, they're stopping their trade. They're changing over their industry. They're going over to rationing, right? They're not going to have the money to pay their workers. They're just going to give them ration tickets. And aren't they going to be glad when they're let out of their apartment? Oh my gosh, I'm not under house arrest anymore. I'm not in my apartment. I'm able to go out now, and I can go to work and I can see my friends. They're going to be, elated, right? And it's like, well, who cares that they're not paying me? I mean, I'm being fed, and now I can move outside my apartment. This is probably the logic of how they get people to accept. Yeah.
So almost as if these lockdowns, which right now I think we're nearing 300 million people that are locked down in China, that's part of a psychological operation to prepare the Chinese people for a war economy and a war system. But also, I'm sure it's been really effective at doing what you mentioned earlier, at weeding out the dissidents. So they can see the people that are on social media trying to talk about the lockdowns, people that are denying, not obeying the lockdowns. It's a really good exercise to get people in line for the control of a population that's needed once they move into a war. I mean, is that how you understand it?
Yes. Yeah, it is, because they're going to see who follows the rules and who doesn't. And they don't, Mao made the statement back in the 1940s, let's just kill everyone who doesn't follow the rules. And it worked for him. You would think it wouldn't, to be that sanguinary, to be that bloody. You would think it wouldn't work. He won the Civil War. It's really creepy, but he did. And yeah, I think you've got that right. Absolutely.
Well, it's also, I have also been studying, communism in China, that part of their whole philosophy and how they've run their communist system is to really, at any given point, keep about 5% of the population under some form of persecution, which really keeps the other 95% in line. Like going back to 99, when they outlawed the practice of Falun Gong, where you had nearly 100 million practitioners of this that overnight became enemies of the state. They're rounding them up, torturing them, now selling their organs. It's just, this has been similar to how this has been a 100-year war on the West. they've also been waging this war on their own population to get them in line with what they need to do this.
Yeah, these are the techniques pioneered by Mao in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, how he ended up becoming the ultimate warlord of China. And you have to remember there's foreigners, there's Westerners in China. They're locked down here. There's Chinese liberals who sympathize with them. So being able to identify them, separate them out from the population without them being able to organize, they can't form a crowd, they can't get sympathy, they can't reach the media, they're isolated. Imagine when you're locked down, you're isolated, you really are helpless. And then they can come for you one at a time. They can, all right, we'll come to this neighborhood, we'll get the bad people out here. Oh, look, there's some Brits and Americans and Australians here. We'll put them in a camp, or we'll put them in, what do? You put foreigners, when you go to war, you put them in internment camps. Or maybe you just kill them. But internment camps, both Britain and the United States put people who are sympathetic to the Axis, or in the case of America, Japanese Americans, in internment camps. Right? So, and of course, the Germans famously had their concentration camps, that anyone that disagreed with the regime, and certain ethnic minorities like Jews, were put in those camps. And of course, Russia famously had its concentration camp system. So, all war powers in World War II did this, basically.
Yeah, and you can see that you can see that happening. You can see the foundation laid for this. So we're going to now open this up for the Q&A portion, because I've been seeing the questions coming in, and there's some incredible questions. So for those of you that are watching, like I said, we're going to keep the Q&A portion public, but if you want to ask a question, it's only going to be done through your account over on Rise TV. There's a free trial in the description below. So I'm going to start with this question, and this came in from Debs and Michelle, who's asking about the Chinese troops in Canada. And so said that Canada allows Chinese troops in their country. Do you think that they will try to invade the U.S. through Canada and also up through Mexico, South America, et cetera? Basically, is that part of what you see happening?
Well, I guess we've seen this film taken from British Columbia of Chinese people in, military utilities or camouflage utilities, hiking, without weapons. And there's some kind of Chinese camp. And of course, there's a large Chinese population in British Columbia, in the Vancouver area. And the question is, are these Chinese citizens? The question is assuming that there's a Chinese army there. Not that anybody knows there's a Chinese army there, but if you have Chinese have infiltrated Vancouver, British Columbia, have they then smuggled in weapons and uniforms, and can some number of Chinese suddenly put on those uniforms, get those weapons, and take over the port of Vancouver? I think the answer is yes. When you look at the German Operation Weserübung that they invaded Norway, this is what they did. They had infiltrators already in Norway. They put on the uniforms and got their machine guns. They grabbed airfields and ports. The Germans came in through the airports and the ports. This is very possible in Western Canada. It's definitely possible. As far as them advancing against the United States, going across into British Columbia, from British Columbia into Washington State, yeah, but probably not right away, because there has to be something done to Seattle, right? You have to, what are you going to do to Bremerton, Washington? That's kind of in between there. That's our big boomer base. You would have to strike that base at the beginning of a war that involved invading North America. And that strike would probably have to be nuclear, which means, and it would have to be a ground burst. So you'd have a heavy fallout area. So you probably couldn't even operate troops there at the outset of the war. You'd have to wait 13 to 18 days before you could go through that area, because the fallout dissipates. The intense short-term fallout dissipates. So that would be my only comment. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Something that I'm seeing a lot in the comments in general, and this is not just this interview, the handful of interviews I've done with you, where people are saying, oh, you're just fear-mongering and this, but this is very real. information. You're someone who's been studying communism, especially the Russian and the CCP, Soviet Union, for a very, very long time. But for people that are kind of saying, look, this is fear mongering, I don't want to look at it. What would you say to that?
No, I don't. Obviously it's unpleasant. Look, I've been studying this unpleasant subject for 35 years or more. I hope it's not true, but what I'm relating are facts. People, you can read the transcript of the Standing Party meeting in Guangdong. You can read the Wall Street Journal about them preparing to seize Western assets and to pull their assets out. And all their war preparations, they have 67% of the world's food stockpile in their country. Why are they doing this? They've been stockpiling gold and raw materials of all kinds. China has a 10-year supply of oil, of what they would need. That's how big their petroleum reserve is. They could go without oil imports for 10 years. And you can look that up on the internet. The numbers are there. What they produce and what they import. They import something like 7 million barrels a day. You look at what do they have? 25 billion barrels in their stockpile. You can do the math. It turns out to be
storage as well.
7 years. Yeah. So, unless I made some mistake, so why have they made these preparations? This is not innocent. And look, if you know the history of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, Communist Party of China, their goal is to make the world revolution, World October, take the whole world over, make it communist. And, if you think I'm making it up, let me quote the former head of the Communist Party of China, Hu Jintao, in 2008. He was the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and this is a quote from him. In history, the Western powers used warships and opium to colonize China. Now the opposite has happened. We will use our open policy, seize the economic crisis in the West as a historical moment, and use effective measures to turn them into socialist China's economic and cultural colonies. Our colonization of these countries is the historic process of communism's triumph over rotten capitalism. We Chinese communists must shoulder the great historical mission and use socialism to defeat capitalism, eventually liberating the entire humanity with communism. It's pretty clear. Wow. And this is, look, there's hundreds of these statements made by Chinese leaders right up to the present. And I'm not making it up. So I just want, you can have a fantasy of an Easter bunny and a tooth fairy and whatever. I'm sticking with the facts.
Yeah. A good question that has come in from Kate, who's asking, do you think that the lockdowns and the ties between the WHO, Tedros, Xi Jinping, that crippled the economies in countries around the world were also laying the groundwork for what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, if you look at the World Health Organization, the WHO, it has been said by people who have studied this organization that it is controlled by China. It is a Chinese puppet. And the leaders of it have been communists. Look, communism is not just in China, it's a world movement. These crazy people exist in the US. Look at Black Lives Matter and Antifa. These are communist organizations. I think that two of the leaders of Black Lives Matter admitted that they were Chinese communist trained. You've got them all over Latin America. You've got Cuba is a communist country. Venezuela, Nicaragua is under Daniel Ortega's communist country. Peru now has a communist president. Argentina has been heavily with, Argentina signed all kinds of agreements with China now. They're pushing Brazil, even despite Bolsonaro being there, they're pushing Brazil into the arms of Russia and China. Brazil is a BRIC country, right? They're part of a bloc. It's called the Brazil, Russia, India, China alliance or economic combination. And they've added South Africa to that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does. Here's actually a very good question from Montana Dude. This is something I've been wondering as well. Who says, is there any information regarding American countermeasures? Are there any rumblings of American military plans? If it's obvious that China can't hide their preparations, is America able to hide their preparations for what's to come?
Well, you may notice that there has been increased, people living near air bases and stuff have noticed increased practicing, increased missions, increased helicopter and air flights. Of course, we are moving things into Eastern Europe, but we've also moved troops into Australia. I don't know how many. So we've also been aware of this problem. The first sign of preparations came after COVID-19. COVID-19 outbreaks began in January around Chinese New Year in 2020, 2 years ago. In late March, if you go back in late March, the US government sent its nuclear war staff for running a nuclear war. They sent them to deep bunkers in Colorado in late March of 2020. And then within a few days, the Strategic Command dispersed all of its aircraft to various bases. And the reason they gave was the threat of storms, weather, right? I didn't think so at the time. I thought, oh, they know. Because this is when the first signs of China getting ready that we started to see. We started to see, for example, in the Eastern Theater, I mentioned before, their military publications were out openly stating that war was coming. And so we had those kind of preparations. And some of my military contacts went cold starting in 2 years ago this month and would not talk to me. So there was something secret going on. And General Todd Wolters, our NATO commander, he's an Air Force commander. He's brilliant, by the way. He, in his testimony to Congress the last 2 years, and then more recently, he talks about China and Russia being together and how we can put pressure on them and actually succeed if a war is between both of them. So this shows a high level of awareness from one of our top generals. And I think Admiral Richards, the head of the Strategic Command, has made some comments. It seems to me they're aware. Even if you don't, you listen to Blinken, the Secretary of State, or the President, they seem to be clueless. I think our military leaders are not.
Which is probably a good thing that we have no idea what they're doing about this.
Yeah, it might be. What I have heard over the last year or so is there's a certain level of desperation of getting things together, because it's like the Chinese and the Russians have been preparing for years. We just became aware within the last 2 years that something is going on with them, and we're trying to play catch up. And you're trying to play catch up. They've been preparing for 30 years. We're trying to catch up in 2. And then we stupidly moved our industrial base to China. And so they make supply chain things. I mean, we got infiltrated and compromised up to the political level. And now we're going, uh-oh, we got a problem. How do we dig our way out of it? Now, we're pretty ingenious as a country. I think we can do it. We've been coping with it. And I don't know, we have real problems with our political leadership. I don't think we have people you can call leaders. I think you've got useful idiots all over the place, not just our top business people. Yeah. And in both political parties, I'm not going to pick on one or the other.
No, I agree.
I think we've got a lot of that. And in Europe, it's bad too. There is in Europe an awakening regarding Russia, but look at a lot of these people. Look at what would the KGB file be on Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England? It's kind of interesting to see him becoming anti-Russian when you think of the blackmail they've got to have on him. And it may just be that we're going to see all that blackmail being poured out in the not too distant future. And you've got Germany. Look, the Prime Minister Scholz of Germany, he is flatly pro-Russian. Even the Green Party people have complained about him. And the people there's great worry. But I talked to a friend of Putin's, 31-year friend of Putin's last week. And, he gave the Russian point of view on a lot of things, but he's very worried. And he's a guy that, he's very worried about where that's going. And Russia could very well make this nuclear and in coordination with China to create a new security infrastructure in Europe, to force Europe. And by the way, the economic problems with oil you're seeing in Europe, you've got connected to this is we know that in about a month, it's thought that Iran's going to get nuclear weapons. So there's talk that Israel, maybe with American help, is going to do a preemptive strike in Iran. that almost certainly will result in the Persian Gulf being closed down, at least for some time. What's that going to do to Europe and Germany that depend on that oil? How are they going to survive that?
And they're already extremely weakened, not getting Russian oil.
The Russian natural gas. They're actually paying in rubles. They're meeting the Russian demand in rubles. You can't embargo Russia. It's too self-sufficient. It's more self-sufficient, especially in raw materials, than Europe is. So who is really coming out ahead? Is Europe going to end up breaking down? Is the European economy going to collapse if this thing goes on in the Middle East? And added on to the war in Ukraine, it seems to me that Moscow and Beijing has thought through this period much better than we have.
Yeah.